A desperate journey begins. Rebecca Walsh pressed her forehead against the cold bus window, watching the Connecticut countryside blur past. Her reflection stared back at her, showing a tired woman of 28 with determined hazel eyes and dark circles that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Inside her worn canvas bag sat everything that mattered: her nursing credentials, a faded photograph of her mother, and the hospital bills that had brought her to this moment. The numbers haunted her. $43,000 for her mother's cancer treatment. The small clinic back in Tennessee had done everything they could, but experimental treatments were expensive, and insurance only covered so much. When the recruitment agency mentioned the Blackwell position with a salary 4 times her previous job, Rebecca knew she had no choice. She had heard the warnings, of course. Every nurse in the network knew about Harrison Blackwell. The Mansion of Shadows. The estate gates opened with an ominous creak, revealing a sprawling property that looked more like a museum than a home. Rebecca straightened her crisp white uniform as the taxi drove up the winding driveway, past manicured gardens that somehow managed to look beautiful and lifeless at the same time. Fountains stood silent, their water still. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass and steel and sharp angles, but something about it felt cold. Through the windows, she could see expensive artwork on the walls, but no signs of actual life. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. He did not need to say anything. His expression told her everything. Another nurse walking into the lion's den. Meeting the dragon. Patricia Blackwell met Rebecca at the door, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. She was Harrison's older sister and the unofficial manager of the estate. Her handshake was brief and cold, her assessment of Rebecca clearly finding her lacking. The house coordinator led Rebecca through halls lined with photographs of Harrison in his prime. A younger man with bright eyes and an easy smile, standing beside presidents and celebrities, cutting ribbons at technology conferences, holding up awards. Those eyes held none of the warmth Rebecca saw now in the recent photos. Something had died in Harrison Blackwell long before his body began to fail. They climbed a sweeping staircase to the second floor, where the atmosphere grew noticeably heavier. Patricia stopped before a set of double doors, her expression hardening. The first battle. The room was dark, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Medical equipment beeped softly in the corner, monitoring vital signs. The air conditioning was so cold that Rebecca could see her breath. In the center of it all, in a bed that looked more like a throne, lay Harrison Blackwell. He was 45 but looked older, his face gaunt and pale, his body diminished by illness and isolation. But his eyes, those dark intelligent eyes, burned with an intensity that made Rebecca take an involuntary step back. He studied her with open contempt, his gaze traveling from her sensible shoes to her tied-back hair. Rebecca could see him cataloging every detail, searching for weakness, preparing his attack. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse but sharp with sarcasm. The gauntlet thrown. Harrison wasted no time testing his new caretaker. He criticized everything from the moment she entered. Her footsteps were too loud. Her breathing was annoying. The way she touched his medical chart showed incompetence. When she tried to take his blood pressure, he yanked his arm away with surprising strength, sending the equipment clattering to the floor. Rebecca retrieved it calmly, her face showing none of the frustration building inside her. She had dealt with difficult patients before, but this was different. Harrison was not just in pain or scared. He was deliberately cruel, wielding his words like surgical instruments designed to cut deep. When she brought his medication, he knocked the tray from her hands, pills scattering across the expensive carpet. Rebecca knelt to collect them, feeling his eyes boring into her back, waiting for her to crack. Unexpected resilience. What Harrison did not expect was silence. Rebecca did not cry, did not yell, did not storm out like the others. She simply cleaned up the mess, prepared a new dose, and placed it on his bedside table with a glass of water. Then she sat in the chair by the window and pulled out her tablet, making notes about his condition with professional detachment. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the mechanical beep of monitors. Harrison grew increasingly agitated by her calm. He hurled insults about her cheap clothes and country accent. He made degrading assumptions about her background and education. Rebecca absorbed it all without reaction, occasionally glancing up to meet his eyes with a steady gaze that seemed to unsettle him more than any verbal retaliation could. By evening, Harrison was exhausted from his own venom, while Rebecca remained composed and present. The night shift revelation. Patricia returned at sunset with barely concealed disappointment at finding Rebecca still employed. She delivered a list of impossible demands for the night shift. Harrison needed constant monitoring but could not stand anyone in his room. He required complete silence but also needed entertainment. The instructions contradicted themselves deliberately, setting Rebecca up for failure. After Patricia left, Rebecca established her own routine. She positioned herself in the adjoining sitting room with the door slightly ajar, close enough to hear any distress but far enough to give Harrison space. She kept her movements minimal and quiet, responding to his needs before he could voice them. When his breathing changed rhythm around midnight, she knew pain was coming. Rebecca entered with warm compresses and medication, working efficiently despite his protests. As she adjusted his pillows with practiced gentleness, Harrison's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with shocking strength. A glimpse beneath the armor. His grip was tight, almost painful, his eyes searching her face for something he could not name. Rebecca did not pull away. She met his gaze steadily, seeing past the anger to the fear underneath. This close, she could see the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched against pain he refused to acknowledge. Harrison seemed surprised by his own action, releasing her abruptly and turning his face away. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Rebecca saw what everyone else missed. This was not a monster. This was a man drowning in suffering so profound that cruelty had become his only defense. She finished adjusting his pillows without comment, dimmed the lights to a soft glow, and returned to her chair. But something had shifted in that moment of contact. Harrison watched her silhouette in the doorway, this strange woman who refused to be driven away, and felt the first crack in the walls he had built around himself. The morning after. Dawn broke over the Blackwell estate with a pale gray light that filtered through the heavy curtains. Rebecca had dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable chair, her body stiff from maintaining her vigil. She woke to find Harrison already awake, watching her with an unreadable expression. For the first time since her arrival, he said nothing as she rose and went about her morning routine. The silence felt different now, less hostile and more contemplative. Rebecca checked his vitals, noting improvements in his heart rate and blood pressure. Whatever demons had tormented him through the night seemed to have given him a brief reprieve. She prepared his breakfast according to the strict dietary requirements, arranging everything on a tray with quiet efficiency. Harrison accepted the food without his usual barrage of complaints, though he picked at it with obvious disinterest. Rebecca pulled out her phone and began playing soft classical music, something she had learned helped her mother during her own difficult treatments. Small victories. Over the next few days, a fragile routine emerged. Harrison still lashed out, still tested her patience with cutting remarks and impossible demands, but the attacks grew less frequent. Rebecca learned to read his moods, understanding that his worst moments came in the early morning hours when pain medications wore thin and memories grew sharp. She discovered that he responded better to directness than to sympathy. When he refused his physical therapy exercises, she did not cajole or plead. Instead, she simply stated the medical facts about muscle atrophy and left him to make his own choice. 10 minutes later, he grudgingly agreed to begin. These were tiny victories, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Rebecca catalogued each one carefully. She also began to notice things that others had missed. The way Harrison's hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. The prescription bottles hidden in his nightstand drawer, medications that were not on his official chart. The photographs he kept face down on his dresser, too painful to look at but too precious to remove. The sister's suspicion. Patricia Blackwell circled like a vulture, waiting for Rebecca to fail. She appeared at random hours, inspecting the room with critical eyes, questioning every decision Rebecca made. Why had she opened the curtains? Why was Harrison sitting up instead of lying down? Why had his medication schedule been adjusted? Rebecca answered each interrogation with calm professionalism, providing medical justification for her choices. But she could feel Patricia's hostility growing. This was not just about competent care. Patricia seemed threatened by any positive change in her brother, as though his suffering served some purpose in the family dynamic. One afternoon, Patricia brought visitors, wealthy friends from Harrison's former social circle. She paraded them through like tourists at a zoo, showing off her tragic brother while making passive-aggressive comments about the nurse who thought she could succeed where specialists had failed. Harrison endured it with cold dignity, but Rebecca saw his hands clench the bedsheets. After they left, she found him staring at the wall, his breathing shallow. The hidden truth. That night, Rebecca made a decision that crossed professional boundaries. While Harrison slept, she carefully examined the hidden medications in his nightstand. Her heart sank as she identified them. High-dose painkillers from 3 years ago, antidepressants that had been discontinued, sleeping pills in dangerous quantities. He was hoarding them, and the implications made her blood run cold. She replaced everything exactly as she found it and spent the rest of the night researching his medical history. The official records told only part of the story. Chronic pain syndrome with no identifiable cause. Depression. Insomnia. But there were gaps in the timeline, periods where he had refused all treatment, and a note about a previous hospitalization that had been heavily redacted. Rebecca began to understand that Harrison's illness was not just physical. Something had broken him from the inside out, and his body was manifesting that trauma in ways that traditional medicine could not address. The breaking point. The crisis came on a Thursday night during a violent thunderstorm. Rebecca was reviewing notes when she heard a crash from Harrison's room, followed by harsh breathing that bordered on hyperventilation. She found him on the floor beside his bed, having attempted to stand on his own and fallen. But this was not just a physical fall. Harrison was in the grip of a full panic attack, his eyes wild and unseeing, his entire body shaking. Rebecca dropped to her knees beside him, her training taking over. She did not try to restrain him or overwhelm him with questions. Instead, she began speaking in a low, steady voice, grounding him with simple observations. The sound of rain against the windows. The softness of the carpet beneath them. The rhythm of her own breathing, which she deliberately slowed, encouraging him to match it. Gradually, Harrison's breathing began to synchronize with hers. His eyes focused, seeing her for the first time not as an employee but as another human being in the darkness. The confession. They sat together on that floor for nearly an hour, neither moving, both processing what had just happened. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice raw and broken. He told her about the accident. 5 years ago, he had been driving late at night, exhausted from a business trip. His best friend, the co-founder of his company, had been in the passenger seat. They never saw the truck that ran the red light. His friend died instantly. Harrison walked away without a scratch, at least not one that showed on the outside. The guilt had consumed him slowly, eating away at his life piece by piece. He sold his company, withdrew from society, and eventually his body began to betray him as thoroughly as he believed he had betrayed his friend. The pain was real, Rebecca understood now, but it was rooted in trauma so deep that no medication could reach it. Harrison looked at her with eyes that begged for judgment, for confirmation that he was the monster he believed himself to be. Instead, Rebecca did something that surprised them both. She took his hand. A new alliance. The touch was simple, but it shattered something between them. Harrison did not pull away. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be comforted, to accept that his suffering was seen and acknowledged by someone who did not turn away in disgust or pity. Rebecca helped him back to bed, but this time she pulled a chair close beside him rather than retreating to her usual post. They talked through the night, not about his condition or his care plan, but about real things. She told him about her mother's battle with cancer, about the small Tennessee town where everyone knew everyone, about the garden she used to keep before medical bills consumed her life. Harrison listened, really listened, and slowly began to share pieces of himself he thought he had buried forever. By morning, something fundamental had shifted. When Patricia arrived for her daily inspection, she found them discussing a book they had both read, Harrison animated in a way she had not seen in years. Her expression darkened with an emotion Rebecca could not quite identify. Jealousy, perhaps, or fear of losing control. The battle lines drawn. Patricia pulled Rebecca aside after breakfast, her cordial mask finally dropping. She accused Rebecca of unprofessional conduct, of becoming too personally involved with her patient, of implementing unauthorized changes to his care routine. The threats were veiled but clear. One wrong step, one complaint, and Rebecca would be terminated immediately with no reference and possible license review. Rebecca stood her ground, explaining calmly that emotional support was part of holistic patient care, that Harrison's improvement spoke for itself. But Patricia was unmoved. She had maintained control of her brother and his fortune for 5 years, and she was not about to let some small-town nurse disrupt the established order. As Patricia walked away, Rebecca understood the real battle. This was not about Harrison's health. It was about power, money, and a family dynamic more toxic than any illness. She would need to be more careful, but she would not back down. Harrison was finally beginning to heal, and she would fight anyone who tried to stop that progress. Trust deepens. Despite the threats, Rebecca continued her approach. She researched trauma-informed care, consulted with specialists who understood the mind-body connection, and slowly introduced new therapies. Gentle movement exercises that focused on breathing and presence rather than pushing through pain. Journaling to process grief and guilt. Gradually opening the room to more light and fresh air, bringing the outside world back in manageable doses. Harrison resisted at first, his old defenses flaring up whenever he felt too vulnerable. But Rebecca had learned his patterns. She knew when to push and when to simply sit in silence, offering her steady presence as an anchor. The medications in his nightstand remained untouched, though Rebecca checked regularly. It was a silent pact between them. He was choosing to stay, choosing to try, and that choice mattered more than any prescription. Dangerous territory. As weeks passed, the professional boundaries between them became increasingly blurred. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Harrison began to smile occasionally, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Rebecca found herself thinking about him during her rare hours off, worrying about his progress, celebrating his small victories. She caught herself touching his arm during their talks, letting her hand linger. He would look at those moments of contact with an expression that made her heart race. This was dangerous territory for both of them. Rebecca knew that emotional involvement compromised her objectivity, that she was risking everything she had worked for. But she also knew that this connection, this genuine human bond, was what Harrison needed most. He had been isolated for so long, trapped in his guilt and pain, that he had forgotten how to let anyone close. She was teaching him to trust again, to believe that he deserved care and compassion. And in the process, she was discovering that her own walls were not as solid as she had believed. The photograph. One afternoon, while Harrison was napping, Rebecca finally turned over the photographs on his dresser. The first showed a younger Harrison with his arm around another man about the same age, both laughing at some shared joke. They stood in front of a sleek office building with a sign that read, Blackwell and Thompson Technologies. The second photo captured the same two men at what looked like a product launch, holding champagne glasses, their faces flushed with success. The third was more personal, taken at a casual barbecue, the friend flipping burgers while Harrison gestured wildly in the middle of telling a story. These were not just business partners. These were brothers in everything but blood. Rebecca understood then the depth of Harrison's loss and the weight of guilt he carried. When she turned around, she found him awake, watching her with those dark eyes. For a moment, she thought he might explode with rage at her intrusion. Instead, he simply said the name she had been waiting to hear. Thomas. Thomas Thompson, the brilliant engineer who could fix anything except the traffic light that failed them that night. Ghost's given voice. Harrison began to talk about Thomas, really talk about him, for the first time since the accident. He described their college friendship, how they had built their first prototype in a dorm room with borrowed equipment and stubborn determination. The late nights fueled by pizza and impossible dreams. The first investor meeting where they had been laughed out of the room, only to prove everyone wrong within a year. Thomas had been the technical genius while Harrison handled the business side. They had balanced each other perfectly, finishing each other's sentences, knowing what the other needed before words were spoken. The company they built together had revolutionized data security, making them both wealthy beyond imagination. But the success had demanded everything from them, including the night Thomas suggested they drive home instead of staying at the conference hotel. Harrison's voice broke as he described the moment of impact, the sound that still haunted his nightmares. Rebecca listened without interruption, letting him finally speak the words that had been poisoning him from within. The turning point. When Harrison finished, he looked at Rebecca with raw vulnerability. He expected her to offer empty platitudes about how it was not his fault, how accidents happen, how he needed to move on. Instead, she asked him a question that changed everything. What would Thomas want for you right now? The question hung in the air between them. Harrison opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, truly considering for the first time. Thomas, who had spent his life building and creating, who saw potential in every problem. Would he want his best friend to waste away in a dark room, punishing himself forever? Would he want the company they built together to be sold off? Would he want Harrison to stop living because he could not? The truth was obvious, and it hurt more than any physical pain. By destroying himself, Harrison was not honoring his friend. He was finishing the job the accident had started, erasing both of them from the world. Thomas would have been furious at the waste. Patricia's final move. The breakthrough did not go unnoticed. Harrison began joining Rebecca for short walks in the garden, his strength slowly returning. He started video calls with former colleagues, tentatively reconnecting with the world he had abandoned. He even mentioned the possibility of consulting work, putting his brilliant mind to use again. Patricia watched these developments with growing alarm. Her control was slipping, and with it, her management of Harrison's vast fortune. She had grown comfortable making decisions in his name, comfortable with the power and access his condition provided. A recovered Harrison would mean the end of her reign. She made her move on a bright Monday morning, arriving with two men in expensive suits. Lawyers. She presented Rebecca with termination papers, citing violation of professional boundaries, unauthorized treatment modifications, and conduct unbecoming of a medical professional. The allegations were carefully crafted to be difficult to disprove, filled with just enough truth to be believable. Standing ground. Rebecca read the papers with a sinking heart, knowing that fighting would drain her remaining savings and possibly destroy her nursing career. Patricia smiled with cold triumph, already calling for security to escort Rebecca from the premises. But before Rebecca could respond, Harrison's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, leaning on his cane but standing tall, his presence commanding in a way it had not been for years. He addressed his sister with icy precision, dismantling her accusations one by one. Rebecca's modifications had been approved by his physician and had resulted in measurable improvement. Her emotional support was evidence of exceptional care, not unprofessionalism. As for conduct unbecoming, the only person guilty of that was Patricia herself. Harrison revealed that he had been reviewing the estate's financial records during his recovery. He had discovered years of questionable transactions, excessive management fees, and decisions made in his name without his knowledge or consent. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had walked into a family war. Liberation. Harrison gave Patricia a choice. She could leave quietly with a generous severance, or he could pursue legal action for financial misconduct and undue influence. His voice was calm but implacable. He was done being managed, done being controlled, done with people who saw his illness as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Patricia's face went through a series of emotions, from shock to rage to calculation. She ultimately chose preservation, gathering her dignity and sweeping from the room with threats that everyone knew were empty. The lawyers followed hastily, and suddenly the mansion felt lighter, as though an oppressive weight had been lifted from the very walls. Harrison turned to Rebecca, who stood frozen with the termination papers still in her hands. He took them from her gently and tore them in half. "You are not going anywhere," he said simply. "Unless you want to." It was the first time he had given her a true choice, acknowledging her right to leave, to protect herself from the complications he represented. The honest conversation. Rebecca should have left. The professional thing, the safe thing, would have been to recognize that she had become too involved, that her objectivity was compromised, that staying would only lead to more complicated territory. But she also knew that leaving would abandon Harrison at a crucial moment in his recovery. More than that, if she was honest with herself, she did not want to go. Something had grown between them that transcended the nurse-patient relationship, something that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. They sat together in the garden that evening, surrounded by flowers that Harrison had not looked at in years. The conversation was difficult, full of pauses and careful words. Rebecca admitted that she had crossed lines she should not have, that her feelings had become personal. Harrison confessed that he had come to depend on her in ways that went far beyond medical care, that she had become his anchor to life itself. They both acknowledged the impossibility of the situation, the power imbalance, the questions about whether his feelings were real or simply gratitude and transference. A new beginning. In the end, they made a decision together. Rebecca would stay, but they would bring in a second nurse to handle the more routine care tasks. They would establish clearer boundaries and undergo counseling to navigate the ethical complexities. Most importantly, they would take time. Harrison needed to continue healing, to rebuild his life and identity beyond his grief. Rebecca needed to pay her mother's medical bills and figure out what she wanted for her own future. If what they felt was real, it would survive patience and proper boundaries. If it was simply the intensity of their circumstance, time and space would reveal that truth. Harrison began working with a therapist specializing in trauma and survivor guilt. He donated a substantial sum to traffic safety research in Thomas's name, channeling his grief into something constructive. He started consulting for his old company, contributing remotely at first, then eventually visiting the office for the first time in 5 years. Full circle. 6 months later, Rebecca received the call she had been praying for. The experimental treatment had worked. Her mother was in remission. She wept with relief, years of worry and fear finally releasing their grip on her heart. Harrison held her as she cried, understanding in a way few others could what it meant to face the possible loss of someone you loved and to receive a reprieve. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, marking the moment that had brought her to his door in the first place. The debt was paid. Rebecca's mother was safe. The original purpose of her employment had been fulfilled. Now she had to decide what came next. Harrison did not pressure her, though she could see in his eyes what he hoped she would choose. She took a week off, her first real break in months, and went home to Tennessee. She sat with her mother in their small kitchen, the same kitchen where she had made the desperate decision to take the Blackwell job. Her mother, weak but clear-eyed, asked the question that mattered. "Are you happy?" Rebecca thought about Harrison, about watching him transform from a bitter, broken man into someone finding his way back to life. She thought about their conversations, the way he challenged her mind and saw her as an equal. She thought about the moment his hand had first held hers, and how right it had felt. The choice. When Rebecca returned to Connecticut, she had her answer. She would stay, but not as Harrison's nurse. She had applied to a prestigious hospital nearby and been accepted to their cardiac care unit. She would have her own career, her own life, independent of him. They would date properly, like normal people, navigating the complications like any couple trying to build something real. Harrison's relief was palpable when she told him. He had been terrified that she would leave, that he would lose the person who had saved him from himself. But he also understood the importance of her decision. She was not staying because she needed the job or felt obligated. She was choosing him freely, as an equal, with her own life and purpose intact. Their first real date was awkward and wonderful. Dinner at a restaurant, surrounded by other people, without the weight of his illness hanging over them. They talked about books and politics and the future, like any couple getting to know each other. Harrison was still healing, still working through years of trauma, but he was present in a way he had not been before. Rebecca saw both the man he had been and the man he was becoming, and she loved them both. Epilogue: Miracles and Choices. A year later, Harrison stood as the keynote speaker at a medical conference on holistic trauma care. He spoke candidly about his experience, about how traditional medicine had failed to address the root cause of his suffering, and how one nurse's refusal to give up on him had changed everything. In the audience, Rebecca sat beside her mother, watching the man she loved share his story with hundreds of healthcare professionals. After the speech, a young nurse approached them, asking Rebecca how she had known what Harrison needed when everyone else had failed. Rebecca smiled, thinking back to that first terrible night when she had been so close to quitting. She had not known, not really. She had simply refused to see Harrison as a lost cause, had chosen to look beyond his cruelty to the suffering underneath. Sometimes miracles were not about divine intervention or impossible cures. Sometimes they were about one person choosing to stay when everyone else had left, about refusing to give up even when giving up would be easier. Harrison found them in the crowd, his eyes seeking Rebecca automatically, as they always did now. He smiled, the kind of smile that still took her breath away, full of life and possibility. She smiled back, grateful for the desperate circumstances that had brought them together and the choices they had both made to fight for something real. In the end, no miracle had saved Harrison Blackwell. Love had saved him. And it had saved Rebecca too.